Do you know what happens when law decides that pain itself can be a form of truth? In 1252, a man in Rome sat at his desk, dipped his quill in ink, and with a few careful strokes, changed the course of justice forever. Pope Innocent IV, with his papal bull ad extirpanda, gave the world permission to do what it had always secretly wanted, to silence doubt, to bend belief, not with argument, but with agony. He declared that heretics could be tortured, stretched, broken, burned, so long as life and limb were technically preserved. It sounds like a restriction, but in practice, it was the perfect loophole. You could rip a man's shoulder from its socket, shatter his legs in iron boots, roast his feet over fire until the flesh fell away, and still say you had kept the letter of the law. It's tempting to think this was just medieval barbarism, something alien to us. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Torture wasn't an outburst of cruelty. It was bureaucracy. It was paperwork. It was the careful fusion of law and violence. Before this moment, Europe's justice was messy, Roman. Law had allowed torture, but mostly against slaves and foreigners. Citizens were supposed to be spared. Germanic tribes relied on ordeals, throwing someone into a river to see if God would spare them, or demanding oaths from neighbors to prove character. For 5 centuries after Rome collapsed, these systems bumped uneasily against one another. But in the 11th century, power was consolidating. Kings, bishops, and emperors wanted uniformity. And when Italian scholars rediscovered the great law code of Justinian, the Corpus Juris Civilis, they also rediscovered something else: a Roman template for using torture as a legitimate tool of the courtroom. That rediscovery collided with a Europe already sharpening its weapons. The Crusades had carried nobles and clergy eastward, into contact with Byzantine and Islamic systems that used their own forms of harsh interrogation. The military orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, returned not just with relics and wounds, but with legal habits that blended Roman precision with the authority of the cross. By the year 1200, torture was creeping steadily into European courts, first in Italy, then through Sicily under Frederick II, whose Code of 1231 spelled it out bluntly. Torture could be used to secure confessions when other evidence was lacking. That's a dangerous phrase. When other evidence was lacking, because when is there ever enough? It was a license to squeeze the truth out of flesh whenever it suited authority. And then came Innocent's bull. Rome had just crushed the Cathars in southern France with holy war, but heresy still simmered. The Inquisition needed sharper teeth. Innocent provided them. He wrote that torture was acceptable if it stopped short of mutilation or death, and if the actual physical torment was carried out by secular hands, so the church could keep its own conscience miraculously clean. It was the perfect legal fiction. Priests could interrogate, scribes could record, judges could rule, and when the screaming began, it was the town jailer who technically turned the wheel. Within a few decades, torture chambers became standard, fixtures of Europe's power centers. Cologne had one by 1260. Toulouse, still haunted by Cathar resistance, followed quickly. By 1300, every major diocese and royal court had its own grim basement of justice, stocked with the instruments of persuasion. This wasn't chaos, it was system. It was planned, measured, codified, and it terrified populations into submission. Imagine it for a moment. You are dragged down into the vaulted stone belly beneath a bishop's palace. The air is damp, heavy with the smell of iron and charred wood. There are ropes coiled neatly on hooks, winches gleaming with fresh oil, buckets of water waiting for their next victim. The scribe sits ready, quill in hand, to record each groan, each broken sentence. You are not just suffering, you are performing, and an audience of authority is watching. The methods, at first, were drawn straight from Roman precedent. The quaestio, judicial torture, used the rack, beatings, the pressure of bonds. But medieval ingenuity soon surpassed its teachers. Devices were refined, pain became calibrated. Torturers learned how far a shoulder could stretch before ligaments snapped, how many turns of the wheel a knee could withstand before the joint collapsed. They became anatomists of agony, and for the condemned there was no way out. If you confessed, you were guilty. If you stayed silent, you were guilty. If you retracted later, it didn't matter. The confession under torture was valid. The system wasn't designed to find truth. It was designed to prove obedience. Consider the rack, a simple rectangle of wood, rollers at either end. ropes fastened to wrists and ankle. Slowly, deliberately, the rollers turned. The victim's body stretched, first painfully, then monstrously. In Carcassonne, in 1329, a man named Pierre Maury was strapped to one such device. At first, he tried to hold out, insisting on his innocence. But as the rollers creaked and his shoulders cracked apart, his body elongated, until onlookers swore he seemed twice his natural height. His screams filled the palace. In the official transcript, there is no description of his pain, only the dry note that his confession was accepted. And if the rack wasn't enough, there was the strappado. Hands bound behind the back, rope looped over a beam, the prisoner hoisted into the air by his own shoulders. The weight alone dislocated joints. Sometimes weights were added to the feet, for good measure. In Avignon in 1335, one victim endured 4 hours of this torment, raised and dropped again and again until his shoulders popped audibly. By the end, his arms hung useless, but still he hadn't confessed. That kind of endurance was rare. Most people broke long before. Fire, too, became a weapon. Feet roasted over coals until flesh peeled from bone. Thumbs locked into screws that cracked with each turn. Iron boots hammered tight until legs shattered like pottery. In 1353, Bernard Clare was strapped above a brazier at dawn. Scribes recorded his answers between screams as the heat blackened his feet, then charred them, then reduced them to smoking ruin. By midday, the stench was so unbearable that witnesses fled the chamber, but the scribes remained. The law required the words, not the truth. It wasn't just physical. Torturers studied psychology with a chilling intuition. First, they would show the instruments, letting fear gnaw at the prisoner's resolve. Then came the first touch, a minor twist, a warning. They learned to stop just short of unconsciousness, reviving victims with cold water or smelling salts, dragging them back into the theater of pain. Confessions weren't just forced, they were orchestrated, and this was only the beginning. Torture had not just entered Europe's courts, it had embedded itself in the very definition of justice. If the medieval courtroom created the rules of torture, the chamber itself became the stage. Every instrument was a character in its own right, crafted, tested, perfected, and the artisans who built them weren't just smiths, they were engineers of fear, men who turned metal and wood into tools designed not to kill, but to stretch the human body to the edge of what it could endure. Pain was not random. It was crafted like a performance, each device capable of tuning suffering to different notes. The rack, yes, was famous, but it was only the opening act. Take the thumbscrew, such a small device. 2 metal plates, tightened with a simple screw, crushing the digits of the hand inch by inch. It didn't look like much, but it was devastatingly effective. Bones splintered, nails tore, and every crack was a signal. Speak now, before the hand is ruined forever. In Edinburgh in 1397, a man accused of plotting against the crown was fitted with boot torture as well. Iron casings hammered with wedges until the bones of his legs shattered so completely that fragments spilled from the device when it was removed. His crime hardly mattered anymore. The spectacle of his agony was the proof of authority. And here's the hook you can't look away from. These chambers were not hidden. They were whispered about in streets, described in grim detail by survivors who limped home broken, or by guards who told stories over ale. Torture wasn't just punishment, it was advertisement. You knew what would happen if you resisted. Fire brought a different kind of terror. Imagine being strapped to a chair, your bare feet resting above a brazier. The torturer doesn't rush. He begins with warmth, the faint sting of heat. Minutes pass. The flesh reddens, blisters, blacken. The smell rises first, that sweet, nauseating scent of burning meat, and the victim knows, with horrible clarity, that his own body is the source of it. In Toulouse in 1353, Bernard Clare, whose ordeal was recorded in chilling bureaucratic detail, was questioned this way, from dawn until midday. Witnesses fled when the stench overwhelmed them, but the scribes stayed, calmly noting his words between screams. Think about that for a moment. The agony wasn't just endured, it was catalogued. But there's something even darker, because medieval torturers didn't just know anatomy, they knew psychology. Sometimes, the pain didn't even need to begin. A prisoner would be led into the chamber, shown the rack, the irons, the screws, He would hear the creak of wood as rollers turned, smell the smoke from the brazier still glowing from a previous session. Many confessed before a hand was ever laid on them. The tools themselves spoke louder than words, and if pain didn't break you, humiliation might. Picture this: a man suspended by the strappado, hands bound behind his back, shoulders tearing as he hangs. The crowd of officials doesn't just watch, they jeer, they question, they tell him his family has already confessed, that his children will suffer next. Sometimes that was true, sometimes it was a lie. Either way, the mind cracked before the body did. But torture wasn't confined to the basements of palaces. It spilled into the streets, transforming executions into public theatre. Picture London's Tyburn, the famous execution ground, where a gallows called the Tyburn Tree stood tall enough to hang a dozen men at once. Crowds gathered in the tens of thousands. It wasn't just a killing, it was a carnival. Vendors sold pies, beer, sweetmeats. Families brought their children. People cheered or jeered as prisoners were carted through the streets. It was spectacle, pure and simple. And here's where the story twists again. Executions weren't only about death, they were about performance. The condemned were expected to play their part. They had to speak, confess, repent, or defy. Audiences judged them. Some prisoners, eloquent in their final words, became folk heroes. Others, silent or angry, were despised. It was reality theatre centuries before television, and the stakes were life itself. Beheading, of course, was reserved for nobles, swift, merciful, and in its way, honourable. When Anne Boleyn was executed in 1536, Henry VIII imported a French swordsman because he was reputedly cleaner with the blade than an English axeman. And indeed, she died in one stroke. Even in death, class mattered. Commoners, though, faced slower ends. Hanging by strangulation could last 20 minutes, as victims writhed and suffocated. Burning alive was the ultimate punishment for heretics. In Constance in 1416, Jerome of Prague was led to the pyre wearing a crown painted with devils. Offered the chance to recant, he refused. Witnesses say he sang hymns as flames licked at his body, his voice carrying until smoke choked it silent. His lips, they wrote, moved in prayer even as the fire consumed him. What was the point of this? To terrify, to demonstrate divine justice and earthly authority in one theatrical act. But it was also more complicated. Crowds didn't always respond the way rulers hoped. Sometimes they sympathized with the condemned, whispering prayers, or even rioting, if they felt a sentence unjust. Other times, they reveled in cruelty, laughing at each gasp and scream. The authorities had to walk a fine line. Executions had to inspire fear, but not rebellion. And when the bodies fell silent, the spectacle continued. Corpses were often left to rot, strung up in cages or nailed to gibbets along major roads. Imagine walking into London across its famous bridge and seeing severed heads mounted on spikes, the flesh decaying, the eyes plucked by birds. Each head carried a message. This is what happens to traitors. It was propaganda in its rawest, most visceral form. Now pause and ask yourself, how does a society live with this? How do people go from bread markets in the morning to burnings in the afternoon? Did they see the cruelty, or did they see justice? That is the terrifying genius of medieval torture and execution. It was never hidden, never shameful. It was official, public, blessed by law, and sanctified by religion. And if you were alive in that time, you probably wouldn't have questioned it. You would have gathered with your neighbors, held your child on your shoulders so he could see, and whispered a prayer that it wouldn't be your turn. Because here is the real hook. Torture wasn't just about the condemned. It was about everyone else watching. It told you exactly where power lived and what it could do to your body if you ever stepped out of line. If the torture chamber was the stage and the crowd, the audience, then the Inquisition was the director, scripting, choreographing, and recording every line of the performance. What made inquisitorial torture unique wasn't just the devices, but the paperwork. Yes, paperwork. Every groan, every question, every scream, reduced to neat Latin phrases written into registers. This wasn't chaos, it was administration. The papal palace at Avignon, for example, contained purpose-built torture chambers in its basements, stone walls thick enough to muffle screams, drainage channels carved into the floors to deal with the mess of blood and other fluids. Wooden benches designed for strappado suspensions, iron rings embedded in walls and ceilings, waiting for ropes and chains. It was engineering in service of pain. But what makes you shudder isn't the design, it's the detail. These rooms weren't improvised dungeons. They were laboratories. And at the heart of this machine was the scribe. Imagine it, a man sitting calmly with ink and parchment while a prisoner writhed just a few feet away. He didn't look at the body perhaps. He listened. Every answer recorded. Every plea translated into legalese. The scribe wasn't just an observer, he was the one who turned agony into evidence. Take the case of Pierre Autier, a former priest, accused of Cathar sympathies in the late 14th century. Initial questioning produced nothing, so inquisitors ordered him to the strappado, suspended by his bound wrists behind his back, shoulders wrenching out of their sockets. The session lasted 6 hours, broken into intervals to prolong the torment. The official transcript notes with almost clinical detachment. At the second raising, the prisoner's shoulders made an audible sound. Imagine reading that in a record centuries later. A sound. That's how pain became history, flattened into notes that stripped it of humanity, but preserved it forever. And here's where the hook snaps back at you. These chambers weren't only about the body, they were about the mind. Psychological torture was every bit as important as physical coercion. Cells were designed not for comfort, but for collapse. Imagine a space 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, barely enough to lie down. A slit of light high in the wall, guards waking you every few hours so you couldn't sleep. No day, no night, only endless waiting. Time itself became the torturer. Even worse, the Inquisition weaponized family ties. One woman, Beatrice de Planisol, a widow from Montaillou, was arrested in 1320. Instead of immediately torturing her, the inquisitors began with her daughters. Beatrice could hear their screams echoing down the stone halls. She didn't need the rack. Her mind broke long before her body ever touched a rope. And the records note it bluntly. The mother's resistance collapsed upon hearing the cries of her children. And this is the part that makes your skin crawl. Much of it wasn't even personal. It was procedure, a step-by-step method. Inquisitors were trained to present fabricated evidence, to tell prisoners that their friends had already confessed, that their neighbors had already named them. Sometimes it was true, sometimes it wasn't. But once one confession was recorded, it dragged down entire communities like a stone in water. The village of Montaillou in the Pyrenees proves it. Between 1318 and 1325, Inquisitor Jacques Fournier, later Pope Benedict XV, interrogated virtually every inhabitant. One person named another. That person, under pain, named 2 more. By the time Fournier was finished, the entire village had been gutted. Parents betrayed children. Spouses named spouses. Trust itself collapsed. What was left wasn't just broken bodies. It was broken communities. Montaillou became a ghost town, its people scattered, its memory preserved only in the meticulous records of their tormentors. Here's where we rehook again. Think about what fear does when it spreads. Torture didn't just destroy individuals, it rewired society. When you can't trust your neighbor, when you can't trust your family, when even silence is dangerous, then authority has already won. Torture became less about extracting truth and more about teaching obedience. And obedience didn't always need fire or steel. Sometimes it needed only suggestion. Inquisitors were masters of the bluff. They would present forged confessions, insisting that your brother or your child had already spoken against you. They would promise leniency for cooperation, only to betray it later. And if that failed, they would force you to watch someone else suffer. The spectacle wasn't just public, it was intimate. Imagine being chained, helpless, while your wife screamed on the rack beside you. What words would you find then? And yet, astonishingly, some resisted. In Avignon, in 1335, a man accused of heresy endured hours of strappado, his arms reduced to useless lumps of dislocation. He refused to confess. The record notes almost with annoyance. The prisoner remained stubborn, even in agony, even. Knowing death awaited him, he held firm. Small moments like that haunt the archives, because they reveal that even in a system designed to crush, the human spirit sometimes refused. But the Inquisition didn't stop with physical methods. It also shaped the mind of the wider world. Sermons preached that torture was a mercy, better to suffer now than in eternity. Officials claimed that pain illuminated truth, that heresy was a disease and torture the cure, and the people believed it, or at least pretended to, because when every whisper could be treason, disbelief itself was dangerous. What made the Inquisition terrifying wasn't only its cruelty, it was its bureaucracy. Torture wasn't random violence. It was legal, justified, documented, stamped with seals and signatures. Pain wasn't hidden, it was written down. And in that paperwork lay the coldest truth of all. This wasn't about justice, it was about control. So ask yourself, what's more frightening? The rack, the flame, the iron boot, or the scribe calmly dipping his quill while someone screamed? The device may break the body, but the paper makes the cruelty permanent. And this is why, centuries later, we can still read these stories, because someone wrote them down. The words may be dry, clinical, almost lifeless, but through them, the echoes of screams still reach us. And that's the legacy of the Inquisition, not just suffering, but memory. If the Inquisition built the blueprint, the kings and princes of Europe wasted no time copying it. What had once been justified as a weapon against heresy soon became an everyday tool of secular power. Treason, theft, rebellion, even suspicion of conspiracy, all became fair game for the machinery of pain. Torture was no longer the church's instrument, it was the state's hammer. Take France under King Philip IV, nicknamed the Fair for his looks, but remembered for his cruelty. He turned torture into a royal art. His conflict with Pope Boniface VIII in the early 1300s gave him the excuse he needed. He ordered the arrest and torture of high-ranking clerics, bending both church and law to his will. The Louvre Palace itself became a fortress of interrogation, with underground rooms designed for the same methods perfected by the Inquisition. When a bishop from Pamiers was accused of treason, his torture sessions stretched for days, each question and scream recorded by royal scribes. The church may have invented the ritual, but the monarchy perfected it. England followed more cautiously. There, torture was always framed as an exception, reserved for cases of treason. But exceptions have a way of multiplying. Under Edward the Firm, captured Scottish rebels were dragged to the Tower of London, where underground chambers echoed with groans. The rack, the manacles, the iron boot, all found their place in those vaults. By the time of the Tudors, torture had become an unspoken tool of royal power. The Tower's little ease, a cell so small that a prisoner could neither stand, sit, nor lie flat, became a legend in its own right. To survive a night in it was its own kind of torment, body and spirit twisted by confinement. Germany, fragmented into dozens of territories, became a patchwork of cruelty, each city-state, each principality, competing to prove its toughness. Nuremberg established a permanent torture facility as early as 1320, staffed by professional executioners who doubled as torturers. This wasn't amateur violence. These were men who treated their craft with the same seriousness as a guild of carpenters or smiths. By the mid-14th century, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV's Golden Bull gave legal blessing to these practices, standardizing the use of torture in criminal prosecution. Venice, with its twisting canals and glittering palaces, hid some of the most refined torture chambers beneath the Doge's palace. Here, water wasn't just for gondolas. It was for drowning, controlled, careful, never quite fatal. The water torture of Venice made the city infamous. Florence under the Medici followed suit, blending politics with brutality. Suspected conspirators were dragged beneath the Palazzo Vecchio, subjected to sessions designed as much to extract confessions as to intimidate rivals. Torture wasn't just punishment, it was strategy. And here's the rehook. Torture was no longer a medieval relic by the 1400s. It was modernizing. Just as Europe was building cathedrals, universities, and trade networks, it was also refining its cruelty. Instruments improved, procedures standardized, scribes trained, torturers became professionals. It was, in its own horrifying way, progress. One device that captured the imagination of the age was the breaking wheel. Imagine a massive wooden wheel, a man tied to its spokes, and an executioner methodically shattering his bones with an iron bar. Each strike calculated, each limb broken, one by one. The victim might live for hours, or even days, his body contorted across the wheel for all to see. It was equal parts punishment, warning, and spectacle. Crowds gathered, children watched, vendors sold food, and justice was served with the crunch of bone. The question, though, is why? Why did rulers embrace torture so fully? The answer is as old as power, fear, and control. Torture extracted confessions when evidence was lacking. It terrified populations into submission. It turned trials into theatre, reinforcing the absolute authority of crown and court. And for centuries, it worked, but cracks began to form. By the 1500s, whispers of doubt grew louder. Humanist scholars started asking uncomfortable questions. If a man under torture would confess to anything, how could his words be trusted? Wasn't truth supposed to be the goal of justice? The Spanish theologian Francisco de Vitoria argued that torture polluted justice instead of serving it. Italian legal thinkers too began to point out the obvious. Broken bones make unreliable witnesses. Then came the Protestant Reformation. Suddenly, the Catholic monopoly on truth fractured. Torture, once defended as a holy necessity, began to look like corruption. Some Protestant rulers deliberately distanced themselves from the practice, not out of mercy, but as a political statement. See, we're better than Rome. The Duchy of Württemberg abolished torture in 1567, citing both theology and practicality. Remarkably, crime did not skyrocket. Justice survived without the rack, and yet the practice lingered. Witch trials breathed new life into old methods. In 1487, the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, argued that witches were so hardened by Satan that only the most brutal torture could force them to confess. Its authors even suggested that women were more prone to witchcraft by nature, giving inquisitors and magistrates an excuse for unparalleled cruelty. Across Europe, thousands of women were stripped, shaved, and broken until they admitted to impossible crimes: flying on broomsticks, sleeping with demons, cursing livestock. Entire villages burned because of words dragged out under the boot or the fire. But the tide was turning. The 30 Years' War in the 1600s left Europe drenched in blood. 8 million dead. After so much brutality, appetite for institutional cruelty waned. Slowly, rulers began to rethink. Louis XIV's France restricted torture to only the most severe crimes in the late 1600s. His Ordonnance Criminelle of 1670 didn't abolish the practice, but it raised the bar high enough that fewer cases qualified. Meanwhile, professional police forces were emerging, bringing with them new methods: investigation, surveillance, and evidence gathering. Why risk false confessions when you could build real cases? Science, too, delivered a blow. The rise of empirical reasoning, championed by figures like Francis Bacon, demanded observation, proof, evidence. Confessions under torture didn't fit into this new framework of knowledge. Torture began to look not only cruel, but unscientific. By the 1700s, the Enlightenment drove the nail deeper. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria, in his On Crimes and Punishments, dismantled the logic of torture. It was barbaric, unreliable, and unnecessary. His arguments spread across Europe, translated, debated, embraced. Prussia abolished torture in 1754. Austria followed in 1776. France finally ended it in 1788, just a year before the Revolution. That would guillotine the very monarchy that had once thrived on the spectacle of suffering. The decline wasn't just law, it was conscience. Philosophers, theologians, even some judges began to speak of human dignity, of the absurdity of truth extracted by agony. By 1800, most of Europe had abandoned systematic torture as a legal practice. What had once been defended as essential to order was now condemned as barbaric. And yet, here's the final hook. It never really disappeared. The devices may have been retired, the laws repealed, the chambers bricked up, but the logic remained. In moments of fear, in times of crisis, rulers have always reached back for the same tools. The names change, the methods evolve, but the temptation to use pain as proof never quite vanishes. So the story ends where it began, not in the dungeon, but in the mind. The question is not whether Europe abolished torture. It did. The question is whether humanity ever truly outgrows the urge to make suffering a system.